Some of you will have heard this before. Some of you will have no idea the history of this topic. And when I'm talking history, I pulled up a document that has been kicking around for a long time, written by a guy by the name of David Thompson, who used to be the library guru here. LibraryCo, soon to be LIRN perhaps, but the system of legal information services that we have actually came to be in 2002. So it's been around that long. Until 2002, all of our local libraries were run independently by the associations. It was every man for himself or woman. And there was a decision made back then to try and fit the system together and create a little bit more of an integrated system and create some stable funding from the Law Society, designed to level the playing field for those of us in smaller areas when we're dealing with people in larger centers and bigger firms who have their own resources. So when it was first created, and I won't give you too many boring details, but the structure wasn't very efficient. It had a board of directors of 15 people. The first thing they did back in 2002 was set up a 5-year business plan. And one of the recommendations they had was to set up a tiered system of libraries, which we still have now. We've got different classes of libraries. And then they proposed to de-staff 15 of those centers. Sound familiar? That was 2002. Now, here we are in 2017, trying to figure out how we can revamp and modernize and recreate that system. And any of you who were here in May or before know it's been a big topic for this organization for a long period of time. With that little brief history of where we then were and where we started with LibraryCo, now we'll tell you where we are in November 2017. Mike, you're going to go through the slides? Okay.
So I wanted to start with, can you hear me okay? I wanted to start with a little bit of review. Some of you have heard me talk about this ad nauseum, and I'm just try different ways to present it. And this was a graph that I created the other day, which shows the LibraryCo budget over the last 10, 11 years. And what this shows is, frankly, the system is stagnant in terms of the size and how much money is being put into it. The system is slowly being starved of money. The inflation rate for legal information, as any of the librarians will tell you, is between 10 and 15%. And yet we're growing the system at best with a 2% increase per year. And occasionally we sometimes even see some other cuts. This, of course, affects the quality of the service, and many library locations in Ontario are not, frankly, keeping up. The other thing I wanted to do was just to review what the bottom line position, if you will, of FOLA has been over the years. And these are the bottom lines that have been mandated by you through various plenaries over the last number of years. So the first bottom line position, just to review, is that we desire to build a better system to service all parts of Ontario. That's critical. We need a system that is integrated and focusing on improving service for all lawyers in Ontario, regardless of where they practice, but particularly those lawyers in rural and remote communities. The system must look to integrate in every way possible the Great Library. In other words, the Great Library cannot be an outlier in terms of governance, budget, or operations. The second of our bottom line positions is that we believe the spaces need to continue to be staffed by qualified and competent professionals. As Eldon pointed out, there have been various points in history attacks on that particular notion. So a bottom line for FOLA and the Presidents is that there should be highly qualified and trained staff in each of the facilities to help with legal information research and support the work of the associations. That's a critical point as well. Third, FOLA believes that the principles behind the structure of LibraryCo, which gives a measure of legal control to FOLA and the TLA and to the practicing bar, must be maintained. In other words, LibraryCo or a similar governance structure, which maintains governance role for FOLA and the TLA, must remain in place. As the examination by the new board proceeds, if that in fact does go forward, the precise nature of the legal structure and the operations of the library system may change, but FOLA will want to maintain some degree of input and legal or shareholder control. This is important because without this governance structure, the voice of all of you, and especially the smaller locations, will be lost entirely. And keep in mind, this was not that long ago that the proposal that was put forward to us by the Law Society would have had the disbanding of the LibraryCo Corporation and replacing it with an advisory board, as they put it, with 2 or 3 of the 10 or 15 seats that they were looking at creating on this board dedicated to us. That would have been an unacceptable position because that would have really put us in an untenable situation. The fourth principle is that we want to see a financially sustainable system. We can all agree that the rising cost of collections and other operating cost inputs are a challenge that can only be partially offset by the inflation-fighting benefits of technologies. But related to financial sustainability is the widespread recognition that there are efficiencies to be found in an integrated system, particularly with reference to things like common purchasing and administrative cost. A stable, rational funding model needs to be developed to maximize the benefit to frontline practitioners. But to make the system financially sustainable, we need more money, as the first graph showed. And to get more money, Convocation, who is the ultimate decider of how much money is put into the system, wants to see changes to the governance structure. So the question becomes then, what can we agree are positive governance changes that will allow us to make the case to them for more money? Our fifth principle is that we must hold on to the physical space. Having physical space for the private practicing bar inside the courthouse is important to our members and their associations. The physical space is important for practical and professional reasons, but also symbolically, and must be reaffirmed in its importance to the entire justice system. We need to ensure that we have all our allies in place, including the Law Society, in case there is ever a move to impinge on the space. So as you may or may not be aware, but there have been rumors over the years in some courthouses, it's not universal, that there have been moves to reduce the amount of space available to the libraries or repurpose some of that space for other things. Our libraries are one of the few so-called outside groups in the courthouse who operate rent-free in the courthouse. So to maintain that status, we need to be continually showing the Law Society and the AG that the space is being used optimally. Next, I just wanted to walk through some of the political reality of what we're facing as well. On the positive side, we have commitments from the Treasurer and the senior management of the Law Society that they do not intend to cut funding for the library system. That's the good news, which is good. The approximately $8 million for the system is secured, but it's also not good enough because it's not growing and there's little appetite to grow the system. And since the fees are tied to the overall lawyer fee, the library line item is an easy mark. The annual fee for lawyers, you'll be hearing this tomorrow from Diana Miles, is going up 14% in 2018. And we were lucky in some respects that the library levy number in that budget remains $194 per lawyer. I believe it could easily have been cut in order to mitigate the rising costs in other areas. On the expenditure side, the funding formula in place today does not recognize where population and demand is growing. Only rarely is the funding formula modified to recognize these realities, which is why you saw in the papers that I distributed that the 2018 budget, that Durham, for example, got a 20% increase in their budget while every other library got 2%. This is one of the rare circumstances where a particular library found an exceptional circumstance was able to make a case to say that their population was increasing to the point that they needed to hire an extra staff, and so they got a one-time 20% bump. The other reality, political reality, is just one of numbers. Benchers control this budget, and benchers are elected. They're effectively politicians. As of the latest numbers, 55% of all lawyers in Ontario practice in Toronto. If you factor in the Durham, York, Peel, and Halton regions, that's 67% of all lawyers practice now in the GTA. So add the library budgets of those 5 libraries, Toronto, Durham, York, Peel, and Halton, and that's $1.4 million, or 23% of the total LibraryCo budget. So put another way, 77% of the LibraryCo budget, or LibraryCo grant, goes to serve 33% of the lawyers. It's not all bad news. If you add $3.5 million spent on the Great Library and consider that the allocation for the GTA area practitioners, then it's 42% of all funding on libraries is spent in the GTA. 42% is spent on 67 or 69% of the lawyers when you count them. So yes, we recognize that a lot of lawyers who operate in the big firms in Toronto have in-house law libraries and they're closer to other resources, but that's where our job ends up becoming. We need to convince the Toronto benchers and the Toronto lawyers who are paying these fees of the fact that law libraries are that much more important in smaller and rural centers. Or not even smaller and rural centers, just any center outside of downtown Toronto. So this all speaks again to why it's so important for FOLA to hold on to our shares to maintain our influence. Because without that assurance, we'll be swamped by these numbers. These are the political reality numbers. It also speaks to the need for FOLA and all associations to continually make the case that we are vibrant and offering a critical service, and to make sure that we are always striving to make it even better. And it speaks, of course, to why it's so critically important that we eventually get the great library under the same governance umbrella too. So to overcome these political challenges, we need to find ways to grow the pie, not work out ways to divide the pie up into the existing pie into smaller pieces. And so to do that, in our view, is that we have to listen to the Law Societies telling us when they say they want to address the governance issues first. We're not, frankly, in a position to say no on that. We need to listen to them. And we have to give in on some things in order to protect on other areas and move us into the system of growing. So on the points of governance, which is what we'll talk about next, this is where we're headed. So since May, okay, I guess in May, the Law Society and FOLA presented together on an update on where the discussions had landed up to that point in time. And there was some controversy about that presentation. That's to put it mildly. But since then, we have consulted widely. We've struck an ad hoc advisory committee of presidents, consulted with our PRC committee that includes a number of staff, and we heard the message loud and clear, as did the Law Society, that the staff transfer proposal as a base position was just a non-starter. And we agree. We also heard from many of you that there are other aspects of the LIRN, the LIRN proposal, that hold a lot of promise, or at least was intriguing, but that more detail was needed. And again, we agree. So we met with the Law Society in September to express those views and discuss the next steps. And we've written you on those next steps, but to quickly review what they were, we're not calling it LIRN 3.0, but just for the purposes of this conversation. So I don't think we're quite at the point of having different iterations of this yet. But for the purpose of this conversation, what is on the table now from the Law Society is that it's an opportunity to reset and revitalize LibraryCo. And those are important words as well. To make explicit that the focus is on competence, and therefore explicitly aligns with the corporation, in whatever form it takes, with the goals and mandates of the Law Society. There's an opportunity to revitalize the governance with a skills-based nominated board with accountability to the shareholders. And the plan will be for that board to then hire a director or senior manager to build the system. But let us be clear as well, the association staff remain staff of the associations. No change to their status. Another important consideration. We're now talking about a guarantee of funding for 5 years. The first set of proposals was for a 3-year pilot project, and now they're talking about this being a 5-year window. And within that 5 years, there is an opportunity to make the case for growth and new funding to the Law Foundation and to Convocation. No guarantees that we'll get any of that money, but we do have an opportunity to make the case. So while a 5-year funding guarantee is great, it doesn't necessarily speak to growth, which is where we obviously want to go. Another component that we're still talking about is that library levy becomes the competence levy. You know, we've heard some of the concerns that this may allow for funds to be redirected away from legal information resources into other areas of competence development. But as long as we are a shareholder at the table, we can keep an eye on this part of it. We're watching the funds and where they go closely, and think that this risk is minimized against the advantages that we see, or that I could foresee, to having this levy that doesn't have a target on it. Frankly, put bluntly, it's harder to cut something that says competence when your mandate is all about competence than it is to cut something called library when that's seen as an extraneous service. For now, the great library conversation remains off the table, but the Law Society knows where we stand and hasn't dismissed us entirely. At one meeting, in fact, they acknowledged that eventually it all has to be folded together, but that was when the Law Society thought that keeping everything together meant that the county law libraries would become their property. So in the meantime, we keep pecking away at that one. As for next steps, we need your input today and over the next couple of weeks, obviously. The plan from the Law Society and from the shareholders is to retain a consultant to develop the board criteria and to recruit that board so that the consultant would be retained this fall sometime. I don't have an update on the latest of that procurement yet, but that is the plan. And so that will take a number of months to go through that process. We will have input into that. All of you will have input into that. And then a new board is recruited. That will take a number of months. And so we're looking really at most of 2018 for this to take place. And that new board will then install or set out to develop the criteria and hire a senior manager or director, title to be determined. So the questions for plenary: can you endorse LIRN 3.0 in quotation marks? Again, I don't want to call it that per se, but just for the purpose of this conversation. And do you have recommendations and ideas for what the skills, and characteristics of that skills-based board? I've already participated in a few conversations with people suggesting that we have to make sure that lawyers remain part of this mix, and I would tend to very much agree. And recommendations and ideas for the skills and characteristics of the senior manager. So with that, I don't know if Jay has any other comments to
Yeah, I do have a couple of things. Right now, we do feel fairly confident in the fact that the physical space is protected, but when we talk about the fact that that had been rumored for a while, I mean, my sense, and this is just my sense, is that this really does rise and fall with the Attorney General. I look at the CCLA as an example where the renovation project for the CCLA library was in complete stall under the last Attorney General, and then Yasser Naqvi became the Attorney General, and suddenly it's moving forward because he seemed to have a better sense of the value of libraries. The benchers, it's very frustrating to still be met with a bit of a blank face in the sense of the value of libraries for benchers that we've been talking to for a long time. So this does become a political issue, either through our representatives in the AG's office and also the benchers, and that's where, when we talk about, I have to say that of any issue that we've ever discussed in FOLA and previously CADALPA, the one that had sparked the most reaction was libraries. And I get that because it's the hub of the association. But it is very much something where I think it kind of falls off the radar, or something becomes more stable, and then everyone seems to forget it, calm down, and then all of a sudden flares up again. And what we're asking you is to stay engaged, because this is a slow process. It's going to be slow, but the fact is that if we lose sight of all of the concerns that have been raised, when they flare back up and nothing has happened, it's going to be even worse. When we did the consultation back in May, and one of the reasons this is completely in camera is because if I had done that presentation again, I would have had an in-camera session before we had the presentation with Diana Miles and Sheena Weir and Mike and myself, only so that we could give you an idea of what had gone on behind the scenes. You could have then heard it with that viewpoint, and so I wish we had done it that way. We do want to hear your views. We do want to consult. When we consulted after in May, I promised you at the end of the May plenary that we wanted to consult on libraries and that we wanted it to be a meaningful consultation. We then set up 4 conference calls and said that we didn't have any number in mind. We're just going to set up those 4 to start with. And the criticism we got back was, you're trying to ram this down our throat, where I was thinking that if we set up these conference calls early and quickly, there would be an acknowledgement we really did want to consult. So I had done it to make sure that the people who had just heard the presentation and knew we really wanted to consult, but what it looked like was that we were trying to ram it down. It's now a very slow process. It is now, the brakes have come on. I don't think that with the change with Rob Lapper leaving and Diana Miles coming in as the acting CEO, I think it's going to go, it's not that it's stopped right now, but if it's so slow now, and it's going to go down another gear, because nothing has happened since our last meeting when we talked about getting an RFP for a consultant that's going to tell us the matrix of the board, or the metrics of the board. I mean, it's ridiculous that we met in September, and we have not yet had the RFP developed that's going to give us the consultant, that's going to give us the metrics. I mean, it's just, to say it's slow is an understatement. And that's not bad. We've heard from you that you want it to be slow. But when I spoke at COLAL at the end of October, my instructions when I was asked to speak was that I was given a series of questions and asked if in the hour that I was speaking I could make everyone feel better. I'm not sure I did that. I know I didn't make. I think the librarians. I got a good reception from the librarians. Unfortunately, there was somebody there from the Law Society who I did not make feel better. I know now that did not feel better at the end of that discussion. But I told the librarians that they need to stay engaged because they really are the ones that are consistent. Because as the precedents change and as time moves forward, and this is a slow process, they're the ones that are going to have this historic memory. They're the ones who are also very vulnerable, and they're the ones that have all the knowledge. So I say that because I do worry that this process is going to go at such a snail's pace that we might be faced with another issue of we are being ineffectual. So while we want to talk about these two things, the skills-based board and the director, and I'm not sure I agree with Mike's take on the director. I think there was some talk about whether they're going to do the director at the same time as a skills-based board or try to recommend that. You have to know that it does, if it feels like it's very similar to LibraryCo, it's because it is very similar to the original LibraryCo, and we didn't mind that. Having sat on the LibraryCo board, having individuals sitting around there with other skills would have been very helpful. So I fully endorse, I'm not saying that we were an unskilled board. I like to think we were a skilled board, but I like to think that having someone there with library services or information services, having someone there with HR, having someone there from an accounting field, having people there with different skills would have been very helpful to have a richer discussion. So one of the reasons we're pushing this is not because the Law Society is actually pushing this right now, although we did say we'd bring it in November, and we do have the problem in that our plenaries are 6 months apart. But it's also to see whether or not this is something that we're headed in the right direction, because if we're not headed in the right direction and you really can't support these two steps, which are fairly mild in my view, then we're going to be faced with a situation where we're going to be telling the Law Society we can't reach any consensus, and then we're going to have a different conversation. So I'm hoping that through the discussion you do see some merits in this. I do want to hear all your concerns, but I'm hoping you do see some merits in at least these 2 points because I think it's important to social progress. Eldon?
Yeah, maybe I'll just I'll try and summarize what's been a very lengthy process with the Law Society on this topic and leave you a sense of what we need to try and get started on now. The discussion went like this over many trips to Toronto, many long meetings, formal and informal. Law Society, we need to change libraries. We don't think they're working properly and they can be better. So we're going to take it over. FOLA, no. Law Society, okay, well, things are going to change. Do you want it done to you or do you want to participate with us? That's the whole thing, I think, in a nutshell. That's it. Only lawyers could drag that out into years. But we really are at a point, folks, where we really need your thought and your input and your direction on these things because it can't just stay the way it is. Even if we would all say, listen, we're fine with the way it is, we'll just leave it alone, we don't want to do anything, let's just move on. That's not an acceptable answer, particularly to audit and finance at the Law Society. So we can't ignore it forever, and we might as well try and get out in front of it, and I agree with Jay. The suggestion that the system, as large as it is, with 46 sites and dear knows how many staff involved in the process, including all of you, it needs a central hub, it needs a director, it needs somebody that knows what they're doing and somebody who's got the best interests of that system at heart. They've recognized, just for those of you who have been involved in the past with some of the heads of LibraryCo, not to mention any names, but Martha Foote and Susan Hebditch, they recognize that they've got to get somebody with good small p political skills who will be able to go out and talk to staff and work with those people. So that's a big plus for us. They know that. I think we need that director. I think a skills-based board is a better board to try and run this operation than is, 3 from us and 1 from the TLA and 4 from the Law Society who may know nothing about libraries may know lots. There's just no guarantee what you're going to get. So hopefully, by the end of today, we'll have some more feedback to take back, and at least we'll be able to report back that, we're on side and we're willing to work to try and make things better.
So what we're going to do, unless we're going to keep this discussion going on this topic in one of our breakout sessions.